Well, you can tell by the fact they gave me an hour, this is going to be a long lesson. So I'm not taking very long on introductions. So I want to say to everybody what a joy it is to be here. Thank the elders for the invitation. I love seeing this good-sized audience, and if I had my druthers, you would all be in the middle 2 rows here. But I'll just not try to do that because I don't want to use up the time. But thank you for being here, lots of young people, and I'm talking to you about a topic of vital importance in my judgment. I have the goal this year of developing a whole series of new lessons because there's so much wonderful new material on this general theme of evidences for why we believe in God. So we've titled this lesson, The Great Designer, Evidence from the Chemistry of Living Things. So be aware that we're going to spend most of our time tonight looking at God's other book. God has 2 books in which He's revealed Himself. The book of Revelation in the Bible, and we're thoroughly convinced that's the Word of God, but we also believe there's a grand revelation of God in the natural world. So we call that His other book. And I hope no one in this church building will take offense that we're spending relatively short time in the book of Revelation, God's initial and primary book, but most of our time in His other book. So that's my introduction. It's time to get into the lesson immediately. I want to make one other brief comment. This is a science lesson, and I do not allow sleeping in science classes. And by the way, I've taught a long time, and I can see you. So if things start getting a little rough, it's Wednesday night and you just had a big supper, then I will take a little break and make you stand up because we're not having sleeping. And part of the reason for that is what I'm talking about tonight is something of vital importance in our time. And I want you to hear every word of it. You'll remember about 10%, but I want you to hear every word of it and be, I hope by the end, in greater awe of the great designer than you ever have been. That's my goal, and that was my prayer today. So thank you. Let's get at the lesson. Since the 1960s, ladies and gentlemen, actually the 1950s, you have lived, some of you have lived that long. Raise your hand if you were born before 1950, please. Make me feel better. Okay. Those of us who've lived since 1950 have lived in the most exciting generation of all mankind. Because during this period of time, from 1950 to the present, about 70 years or more, we have discovered more about life at the biochemical level than in all of man's history prior to that. In 1951, when Frederick Sanger first described the makeup of a protein, first time in history, and he described the sequence of amino acids that made insulin, and it was a headline, and he received the Nobel Prize, 1951. He received it in 58. In 1952, there was a great experiment done called the Urey-Miller experiment. Some of you may have heard of that, in which they put together an experiment to try to test how things might have been on early Earth, and put a few things in it, shot it with electricity, and out came some amino acids. And of course, that was an experiment designed to show that you can produce living things without God. And I can tell you it was on every newspaper. It was blasted everywhere. And Yuri and Miller were highly recognized for that particular event. That was 1952. In 1953 is when James Watson and Francis Crick first discovered the structure of DNA, for which they received the Nobel Prize in the 1960s. This, ladies and gentlemen, was a breakthrough in all time because it has completely changed everything about how we understand living things. About that same time is when we decided that the space program was going to be emphasized. Some of you remember there was a grand event in 1957. Anybody remember? This is a class, so you can answer. 57, old-timers. Sputnik. You kids even know what that is? That was the first object put into outer space orbit, and the Russians did it, not us. Scared us to death. Began the space race, And some of you remember that John Kennedy said in the 60s, our goal is, before the end of this century, to put a man on the moon and bring him back. You remember? Thank you for nodding your head. So it's an exciting 70 years, ladies and gentlemen, founded on these amazing things that happened all in the 1950s and the early 1960s. And so, 1969, July the 16th through the 24th, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins went to the moon. And you remember Neil Armstrong made the first step on the moon. What were you doing that night? Watching like I was and everybody else on Earth? It was a grand event. Who would have ever dreamed of man walking on the moon? Science put to work. So we're in the age of science, ladies and gentlemen, and it has become almost our God. That's what concerns me. And so while there were amazing things happening, there was growing disenchantment with both the idea of God and the necessity of God. And so, Time magazine, April 8th, 1966, Is God Dead? Was the theme of that magazine. And you can imagine if Time magazine wrote that, it was a popular issue going on right then. And it was the speech of the scientific community and everybody else. And the religious community, may I add. It was also about that same time that somebody most of you know, A.W. Dicus, wrote this song, Our God, He is Alive. And he wrote it specifically because of that. Because the God is Dead movement was very much alive. And he wanted us to declare with all the vim and vigor we could, our God is alive. So here we are about 60 years later, and it's still one of our favorite hymns, isn't it? And it speaks loudly to what we believe. I certainly hope everybody in this audience, if you're here tonight and you're not a believer in God or you're an agnostic and are questioning, thank you for being here. Is God dead? Well, I can tell you that some of the folks who are theologians in the 60s were saying things like this. Thomas J.J. Altizer and William Hamilton, in their book, Radical Theology and the Death of God, they said in this magazine and in their book, we must realize that the death of God is an historical event, that God has died in our cosmos, in our history. The dead God is the God of the historic Christian church and beyond the church of Christendom at large. So in case you didn't know it, ladies and gentlemen, your God, you Christians, died in the 1960s. So they said. This is not scientists speaking. This is theologians, preachers in pulpit. So, in contrast to that negative picture, I would say to you, if you young people that are here that are college age, if you were in college in the early 1800s in Great Britain or in a good bit of Europe, you would have had a course in which you studied natural theology. And the text I have before you was one of the most popular books used in the early 1800s. And if you look at the subscript under the title Natural Theology, it says, Evidence of the existence and attributes of the deity collected from the appearances of nature. It was a book widely published, widely believed. That course was taken by Charles Darwin, among others. And I can tell you that William Paley, who wrote this treatise, was very much a believer in God, and he used science to undergird that principle. So I'm going to read you how that book starts. I'm reading from somebody else's book, but it's a direct quote. So class, you ready? You're in my class. I'm William Paley, and I'm teaching you about natural theology. Here's how my class starts. In crossing a heath, I almost want to do this in British English. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone. And we're asked how that stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I know to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch on the same heath. And it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think that the answer which I had given before, for anything I knew, the watch might always have been there, would not have been acceptable. Would you agree, class? Because an examination of the watch could very quickly result in the knowledge that somebody had to make this. Right? And that would be the beginning of my class, from which we would then leap to nature. And he would teach you that in nature there are things much more complex than a watch, all of which speak to more loudly and clearly that they must also have been grandly made by a grand watchmaker or a designer. And so it was very common practice in those days to use the natural world and the study of it to support one's belief in God. I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that is not the common view in your time. In fact, it is most commonly rejected, especially by the scientific community. And there are lots of reasons for that. I don't have time tonight to go into all the details of why that is the case. But it is the case nevertheless. So, because we're in a church building, and we're here with mostly God believers, I think it's fitting to show you that the Bible in the New Testament teaches us that nature can show us there's a God. So I'm looking at Romans chapter 1, verse 20, which says this: For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful. That passage, ladies and gentlemen, teaches us that we can see the invisible God by the things that are made, and from that conclude his eternal power and his divinity, simply by examining the natural world. That's what I'm going to be doing with you tonight. So it's perfectly founded on a scriptural principle. But I will not be using the scriptures, because I am convinced the testimony of God is grand and amazing enough without this book to convince you to have faith in God. In Rotary, that'd be a $15 fine. Sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, what the Bible has said in Romans 1:20 is what we now call the argument from design. And the argument is this: if you see things that are designed, it clearly makes you think there was a designer behind it. Is that logical? It does seem like to me. I believe it's always been the strongest argument for the existence of God from the natural world. So I turn your attention now not to this book, which I'm going to lay over here, not because I don't appreciate it and would love to preach from it, but because tonight we're looking at God's other book. And here is Mr. Richard Dawkins, professor of public information of the sciences at Oxford University. I can tell you Richard Dawkins was provided a special salary at that school, funded by one of our large moguls over here, as a billionaire, to publicize what science believes these days and to straighten out all of us ignoramuses. and he's about his business. So I'm going to quote from him in this book called The Blind Watchmaker, published in the 1980s. Let me just look exactly and I'll tell you. Copyright 1986 for the first edition of The Blind Watchmaker. And interestingly enough, he starts chapter 1 making this statement: biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. You listening? And then he spends the rest of the book trying to convince you they have the appearance of being designed, but they were not. There was no design at all. They just looked like it. So he says regarding Mr. William Paley's book, in page 5 of this text, Paley's argument is made with passionate sincerity and is informed by the best biological scholarship of his day, but it is wrong, gloriously and utterly wrong. The analogy between a telescope and an eye, between a watch and a living organism, is false. And here's what he says: all appearances to the contrary. The only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics. If you've not been in my class before, when I pause for a minute, I just said something important. And it'll be on the test. Here's a professor of the publication of science saying the only thing you need in the way of a watchmaker is the blind forces of physics. Now, he does go on to say, albeit deployed in a very special way, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, has no purpose in mind. It is the blind watchmaker. And for the rest of this book, for 300 pages, he tries to convince you that things look like they're designed, but natural selection, acting on random variations over millions of years, did it. You don't need God. Because natural selection is the blind watchmaker. And I can tell you, folks, since 1859, when Darwin first published The Origin of the Species, that notion has swept the world. There is no more influential book on the face of this earth. The Bible's in a different realm. But second to it, in my judgment, is The Origin of Species and the effect it's had on mankind. And it's as wrong as it can be. But Dawkins says, we don't need any other explanation. It's a blind watchmaker. So, class, for tonight, I want you to turn with me, and I want you to be the judge and the jury, and I want to present to you the evidence. I want to present to you some chemistry tonight about living things that we've learned in the last 70 years. And when I get finished, it is my hope that I will convince you there is no way on God's earth the blind forces of physics acted upon by natural selection could have produced what I have just explained to you. And by the way, I make no excuse for getting a little feisty and loud, because you hear enough of the other side of this story all the time in all the media and in all the science textbooks, and you need to hear the other side. And it needs to be loud and clear. I believe it is beyond question that what I'm going to explain to you tonight had to be the result of a grand designer. You have two choices. Nature did it by itself, by the blind forces of physics. No purpose whatsoever. It just came about by natural causes, acted on by natural selection, the God of the universe. Or there was a grand designer who did this, who planned it and purposed it according to his grand will. So, let's start, class. This is chemistry, Biochemistry 101. Components of life. So I thought I would start with Francis Crick's book, Life Itself. Published in 1981. Francis Crick, do you remember, class, that I just told you he was the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. He won the Nobel Prize in 1962. If anybody knows about the structure of the biochemistry of life, it's Francis Crick. So I'm going to refer to page 72 of his book, and we're going to show you how life is made up. What are the critical components? Well, he says, a life as we know it on Earth appears as a synthesis of two macromolecular systems. Now, have I lost you already? Macro means large, molecular is referring to the molecular level of life. He said every kind of life we know about has two great classes. The proteins, because of their versatility and chemical reactivity, do all the work. So, proteins. Living things have structural materials that are made up of proteins. They've involved the construction, the shape and mobility of living things. They're proteins. Secondly, there are tools and machinery in living things, and they are the enzymes. But what's an enzyme? It's a special form of a protein. And it does to do with growth and metabolism. But they're proteins, folks. They do all the work. But if that's all you had, class, you'd never have the first living thing. You also have to have the other great class of molecules that are the blueprints. They're the RNA and the DNA that handle reproduction. They handle the information and the directive function in your body. And you're going to learn just a taste about that tonight that we've learned over the last 70 years that I hope is going to blow you out of your seat. But Crick says all living things, and by the way, when those fellows say life as we know it, may I suggest to you nobody knows any other kind of life? Carbon-based life and water-based life is the only kind of life anybody knows anything about. You can make up fairy tales all you want, but that is how life works, folks. You have to have proteins and you have to have nucleic acids or you don't have life. So, let's do a little bit of lesson on proteins. You have before you, class, this is our first lecture, and I'm going to present to you the 20 common amino acids that occur in proteins. They are glycine, alanine, valine, leucine, isoleucine, proline, serine, etc., etc., etc. And by our next lecture, next week, you will have those memorized, their chemical structures, and their abbreviations. So alanine is ALA, and it has a structure you can see up there. And I'm sure you all get that very readily. Obviously, I'm not spending any more time on that. But here's the thing you need to know, class. Every living thing that has proteins in it, which they all do, their proteins are made up of this, period. Whether it's a one-celled bacteria or you, every protein is a combination of these 20. That's a fact. Do you know what an evolutionist says about that? Why do we all have the same chemistry? Anybody want to take a guess? What do you think an evolutionist would say? Because we all came from a common ancestry back in the ocean millions of years ago. And therefore, we developed from a common chemistry, so we have a common chemistry. What I say, class, is our grand designer had a design that works well, and he's going to build a system of living things that interplay with one another, so why not use the same chemistry on all? I mean, that's just as good an answer. It's very much like the 26 letters of the alphabet make up all our words in English. Every word you want to make up is going to be a combination of those letters, isn't it? So, you can remember this. In proteins, every protein is a string of amino acids. Those 20 right there. And so when Frederick Sanger first mapped out insulin, he mapped out glycine was first place, alanine was second place. I'm making that up, but he made up the sequence. He didn't make it up. He discovered the sequence of amino acids in insulin. And it was several hundred long. That's why it was so hard. But that's a protein, class. Now, I want to make my apology to every protein and every living thing for the limits of what I'm going to be able to say tonight. They deserve much more attention. because there's much more to proteins, and I've told you, we ought to spend the next 6 years about that. But I need to go on and talk to you about the other great class of molecules, the DNA and the RNA. And I want to read to you from Francis Crick's book. He says the nucleic acids, RNA and DNA, seem tailor-made for reproduction, but can achieve rather little else compared to the more elaborate and better equipped proteins. RNA and DNA are the dumb blondes of the biochemical world, fit mainly for reproduction with a little help from proteins, but of little use for much of the really demanding work. I'm sorry, blondes in this audience. I didn't say that. Crick said it. And the reason I like to use it is that's probably the one thing you'll remember. So, the macromolecules that are nucleic acids, what are they good for? Reproduction. Proteins can't do that. But RNA and DNA can't do the stuff that proteins do either. You have to have both. So he goes on to say the problem of the origin of life would be a great deal easier to approach if there were only one family of molecules capable of doing both jobs. But life as we know it employs two, always and forever class. So how in the world did all this get started? When you need both. So they either suddenly came about, or over millions of years they gradually evolved into something, but each of them with a chemistry that you won't believe, or somebody designed it. DNA structure, as I told you, discovered first in 1953 by Watson and Crick, was a double helix with crossbars. It had the capacity, therefore, to reproduce itself, and built into that DNA molecule we learned over the next few years, there is a language. And here it is. It's called the genetic code. Surely all of you have studied that in biology, somewhere along the line. The genetic code is made up of exactly 64 words, and every one of them is 3 letters. Because in DNA there are 4 basic substances, thymine, cytosine, adenine, and guanine, for those crossbars. And a sequence of 3-letter words in that DNA is a message, folks. And we've learned to decode it and to read it. You got it? That's question number 2 on the test. Class, I could rest my case right now. Can you really, in all your heart, believe that the cells containing DNA with a language came about by the blind forces of physics? When we know what the language says, and we know what it does with it to produce things, you really can believe that came about by natural causes. You have more faith than I do. I could rest my case right now, but I'm not finished. All 20 amino acids are coded right here. Well, there's 64 words and only 20 amino acids, so there's duplicates. Alanine has several codes for it, so does glycine. And most of them have more than one code. Sounds like a backup plan to me, like in the space program. There's also codes for stop and start built into the genetic code. I don't have time to explain all that to you, but it is the truth. You go look it up. In addition to that, class, we have learned that inside the cell of every living thing, there is a system by which that code is used to build proteins. And the process involves transcription. I'm going to be very brief here on this part and point a little bit. Here's the DNA up inside the nucleus, and the DNA is being copied. That's called transcription. Then it is matured, and it passes through the nuclear cell wall, comes out here and is caught by the ribosomes. So you've got transcription, you've got migration, and then you've got translation, because the code that came from here is being translated by the ribosomes down inside. You see these 3-letter words right here? This ribosome process is reading that code, bringing in the appropriate amino acids, and building a chain of amino acids, which, class, is a... That was weak. May I say something to you? For the next few minutes, most of the answers to what I'm going to ask you is protein. So don't miss it. A string of amino acids is a protein. Thank you. And so how do you make a protein, class? Well, you have to have a string of amino acids. And what we found out is that's coded in the DNA, but it's made outside the nucleus by a process, class, that takes at least 50 different proteins. That's to build any protein at all. Yeah. You know your nose is made of proteins. Everything else in you is made of proteins and other stuff. So what I'm going to do now for the next few minutes is there's a video clip found in the website of this book, Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer. I highly recommend it to you if you want to really dig in. It's a little bit thick, but I highly recommend it to you. Signature in the Cell. So let's go. You ready, techie guy? His job is to stop when I tell him. Can you make that fuller on the screen, or is that as big as it's going to get? Stop it and see if you can make it bigger. Is that it? Jerry, okay. All right, that's as big as it's going to get. What you see here, class, is the DNA molecule in its glory. This is a cartoon. Stop right there. Now you see, that's not good. You hit the wrong button, Jerry. All right, you see that glob right there, class? That's riding along the DNA because it's in the process of transcribing. That glob of stuff there is a bunch of protein. Thank you. That is. It's a glob of proteins, several of them. It's called RNA polymerase, and it has to ride along the DNA to do enough stuff to make it a copy. Okay? Love to talk to you a long time about that, but let's go inside now. Keep going, Jerry. All right, so you see it's riding along here, and now what we're going to see is that's a glob that probably looks more like what it looks like. Stop. Now we're down inside the DNA, inside that glob, and you can see the DNA has unzipped here, and it's copying it one piece at a time. And folks, each piece that's sticking out here is either A, D, T, or C, and the thing that complements it is the exact complement of that. So a thing comes up, claps onto that one. If that's an A, this one's going to be a T. If that's a C, this one's going to be a G. It's always like love and marriage and a horse and carriage. They only go together. That happens, class, down inside as the RNA polymerase is reading along and opening it up, and the copy's being made. So what you're doing is you're taking the information off that strand of DNA and you're making a copy of it, which you can use for other purposes. The copy, class, is called RNA, messenger RNA. All right? Now watch. Jerry? The problem with this video clip is that it's way too slow. That process takes milliseconds. So it's like, now stop. It has released the copy, the messenger RNA, out into the cytoplasm of the nucleus, and it then goes outside the nucleus. I want you to watch. Go ahead, Jerry. Here it's coming now on the nuclear cell wall, and you will notice the cell wall is full of holes. Stop right there. Do you think any respectable nuclear cell wall is just going to let anything go through those holes? No, class. Those holes are guarded by, guess what? Exactly right. There's a protein guarding the gate right there. Watch now as he comes up to the gate. This is the messenger RNA that wants out. So here we go. See this right here? That's a circular protein. Watch what happens. You may come in, sir, and proceed right through. You're very welcome. Something else comes through. They're not getting through. And it stops. Stop right there. As you saw, that was the nuclear cell wall. From the other side, there's also holes. What do you think, class, is guarding the holes? proteins. Are you keeping count? The RNA is a glob of? There's a bunch of proteins involved in migration. I'm not telling you the whole story. There's a protein that guards the gate. Now we're outside the gate. Keep going. Here comes the RNA message, and it's being taken over by a ribosome. And down inside, we're going to go just a minute. Stop right there. Well, go ahead. This is down inside. And here is the code from the RNA. CAC, AGA, CUA, CCG. Each one of those three-letter words stands for an amino acid. You put a string of those together and you have a? Exactly right. So what you have, ladies and gentlemen, is a code here to make a protein. But in order to do that, you've got to bring the amino acids in, and you do that with a transfer RNA, which is also made by the DNA, and that's another whole story. And by the way, each transfer RNA is for a specific amino acid, of which there are 20. Not yet. But there is a specific protein for every transfer RNA to bring in that specific amino acid for that specific job. Okay? Keep going. So here it is. The first one's finished. It's hooked up to the second one. He's finished. They get rid of him. He's finished. And by the way, stop right there. The transfer RNA goes out into the cytoplasm and can be used again. The amino acids, whoops, I hit the wrong button. I'm sorry. Get back. He was keeping track of right where we are. A little farther. Okay, stop right there. This transfer RNA gets used again, but you see this string of amino acids? That's building a protein, exactly right. So keep going. My comment again is the same. This is way too slow. They try to speed it up and get you some idea of how fast that goes. Come on, move it. Way too slow. Stop right there. You see, coming right here is the blob of a string of amino acids coming out. Here's the messenger RNA coming out of this ribosome. Keep going. There's the sequence of amino acids folding up and making a shape here. Stop right there. So the protein is released and goes out into the cytoplasm, and it's not finished, class. Because the protein is not just a string of amino acids, it's a string of amino acids folded into a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional and a quaternary shape. And until it's completely done with that, it doesn't work at all. And there have been studies done on the folding of proteins and how very few of them really work. So it's a very limiting thing. Go ahead. So the protein goes to another organelle in the nuclear cell structure, or in the cell protoplasm, and it gets inside there, and it has to finish its shaping up because it's not going to work until it's shaped up properly. So on this video, it's got it moving around, twisting and turning and shaping up. And by the way, there's a lot of chemistry going on right there, which I'd love to teach you about. But we will proceed. And in this one, when it gets finished, it turns white, but that's not what happens. And then it's released into the cytoplasm. And my biology book I was reading from earlier today says, and it went out into the cytoplasm to do what it was designed to do. But it wasn't designed. All right, class, that's how you build proteins in your cells. While you've been sitting there listening to me, your body has been building thousands of proteins, which is why you get tired when you're doing nothing, because your body's busy. Okay, next slide. The chemistry of building proteins in every living cell is sufficient to proclaim there must be a grand designer, folks. This did not just happen by the blind forces of physics. We could stop the lecture right here, but I'm not, because we've learned so much more. This was all known by the 1980s. This is 2022. So let's go on. We have learned so much more about the chemistry of living things in the last 50 years. Consider, for example, the single cell, which Darwin and his compatriots in the 1800s says was a simple albuminous lump of carbon. Yeah, There's the lump. I don't know how to say this strongly enough, class. The cell contains more information and does more things than the city of New York, the city of Los Angeles, every major city in the world combined in less time. And they don't tax you either. It is perfectly legitimate to say the cell is a self-replicating nanoscale robot. And what do I mean by that? It's self-replicating because it can and does reproduce itself. This whole cell reproduces itself. Plus, down inside of it, there's lots of things happening that reproduce themselves. It's amazing. Secondly, it's a nanoscale because it's on the size of a nanometer, which is 1/billionth of a meter. Can you conceive of that? A meter is about this long, divided into 1 billion equal parts, and you'll have 1 nanometer. It's almost nothing, folks. We can't see it, of course. But it's on that scale that cells work. And thirdly, it's a robot because its activities are carried out unconsciously and automatically by precision molecular machines that follow ordinary physical laws. That's the truth. So for the rest of my time tonight, I want to give you a little taste about molecular machines down inside of every living cell, because we've learned a whole lot about them. So here we go. You're starting to nod on me. I'm not going to make you stand up yet. A molecular machine is a natural device on the molecular scale with few exceptions made of able to convert chemical energy to produce linear and rotary motion as well as controlling many biological functions. It's a machine, folks. It can make things move, or it can carry things, or it can do things that are required by the cell. And there are literally thousands of them in every cell. Did we know this in 1859? Darwin had no clue about the complexity. I believe firmly in my heart, because I think he was a generally honest man, had he known what we know today, he never would have come up with that ridiculous theory that's supposed to explain all living things. Here are some examples of biomolecular machines: myosin, kinesin, dynein, and motile cilia. Love to talk to you about every one of those. Kinesin, I was going to show you a little video. We don't have time. So, Jerry, we're going to skip this one, but I do want to show you a picture. See that little guy? It's not really a guy. It's a, what do you think? Say it. A protein. And so is this one. That's the kinesin walker, ladies and gentlemen. He walks along a little trail here, and he carries stuff. He's the mover, 2 men in a truck, right? And we had a video clip that shows you how he walks, but I can tell you, I can explain to you the chemistry of exactly how he walks. And they carry stuff inside the cell from one place to another. If you're building something, you need stuff moved, right? You work in a warehouse, you need stuff moved. Kinesin is your mover guy, along with other things, and he is made by the process I showed you a while ago. But he can carry something way bigger than him, if it's a him. It's a protein. So I'm going to skip that video clip. I hate it, but go. I've got to go to the next thing. No. All right. What I really want to focus in on, class, is the bacterial flagellum. Flagellum. It's a whip. Only what we've learned about the flagellum, it doesn't just whip around like this, like cilia. It rotates. And there's a motor underneath it. Right, whoops, let me go back. There's a motor underneath it right here that actually makes that whole thing rotate at amazing speeds. And consisting inside is bushings, there's a stator, there's a rotor, and this whole thing rotates at an amazing speed, and it drives that flagellum. The flagellum, ladies and gentlemen, is hooked to a bacteria. which is a one-celled organism. And there are bacteria with all kinds of arrangements of cilia and flagella. Some of them have one flagellum. Some of them have two. Some of them have 6. I've seen some with 10 or 15 flagella whipping around. And the size of a bacteria is about 2 microns. That's 2 millionths of a meter. So the best thing I can do is look at your fingernails. If you look at it sideways and you divide that fingernail by about 1,000, that's the size of the bacteria. So that's what we're talking about. And it's got little whiplashes sticking out of it. And I want to tell you a little more about that. So here's another picture. You can see all the different parts to it, and here's that filament that's the actual whip. Class, this filament here will be about 5 times longer than the cell itself. It's a long dude. Okay, let me get to my notes here because I want to make sure I say some specific things I want you to hear about these guys. And of course, I have spent a lot of time really digging. Did you know they've been studying flagella for 50 years? We know about everything there's to know about flagella. So let me get to my place here. So I want to first read to you from this little book, Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. I'm on page 73. He says, the bacterial flagellum, in addition to the proteins already discussed, requires 40 other proteins for this function. There are 40 plus proteins in this thing to make it function. Every one of them necessary, and every one of them doing his own job, and nobody doing somebody else's job. The signals, some of them turn on and turn off signals. Some of them are bushings. Some of them are proteins that assist in the assembly of the structure. Some help you penetrate a cell wall. Proteins regulate the production of proteins. Class, you got to have all 40 of them for this to function. Where'd that come from? All right, Jerry, is our slide the next thing? I mean, our video? Okay, Jerry, I want you to go to the video. Here we go. He's going to get the video going. Okay, stop, Jerry. Let me get myself together here. Because I had to write notes for this. I can't keep up with all of this. But I want you to be blown away by what's happening inside the flagellum, class. Okay, go. Many species of bacteria have flagella. Some have one. Some, like E. coli, have several that rotate. See this little guy here moving around? This is a live picture of cells moving. Stop right there. This one has several flagella, but they're all wrapped around one another, so they bundle up and make it more powerful. But that's what's happening in your intestine while you sit there. E. coli are in your intestine all the time, class. They do some good things for you. But bacteria move around by the flagellar action. And you see it right there. Okay, next. Keep going. So what we're going to do first, class, is we're going to do a little primer here on the structure of a flagellum. Stop right there. There's the blow up. This is a cartoon, of course, of a bacterium. This is E. coli with 1, 2, 3, 4 flagella. You see that? And so you see how long these flagella are? That's about 5 times longer than the length of that cell. They're really out there whipping around. And so what we've learned, go ahead now. We've learned how that thing works, and here's a little, we're going to get closer and closer now. Here's the filament, and here's the hook, and it's going to name it for you. Stop right there. This is the hook coming out of the cell membrane, and that hook, folks, is critically important. It is hooked to the filament, which is that flip-lash thing that's really long. Now let's go down inside. Keep going. There's 3 main parts to this flagellum: the filament, the hook, and this whole rotor system. We call this the basal body. And it's made up of a bunch of different parts. down inside the cell. There's a rod, and there's a bunch of rings. Stop right there. And you can see, class, that it's inside the inner membrane of that cell. Did you know that the membrane has 3 layers to it in a bacteria? There's the outer layer, the middle layer, and the inner membrane. And this thing crosses them and anchors that motor inside the cell membrane. Looks like a plan to me. And it's got a bunch of rings. It's got a rod running down the middle of it. Keep going. I love to let you just watch it, but you know what I'm going to say about that. That's going way too what? Yeah, stop it again, stop. Okay. And now for this basal body, there's one part here called the stator, and as it implies, it's stable. It doesn't move. But you see these pieces here that connect to the middle membrane of the cell? Those are, what do you think? Proteins. And everything that makes this up are proteins. And all different proteins. Every one of them different. All right, keep going. And here's the rotor piece that keeps the thing going. Stop right there. Let me get my numbers here. I want to get these right. That rotor motor, class, can turn at 6,000 to 17,000 rotations per minute. That's 283 per second. You listening? That's a motor that can go like this 283 times in a second and cause that whip thing to rotate. In addition to that, class, by the switch of a flick of a switch, it can turn the other direction. Instead of going clockwise, go counterclockwise in a matter of microseconds. So it's going this way, it's going that way. And it's up to speed almost instantly. I hope you can see I'm slightly amazed. In fact, let me read you this piece, if I can find it here. This is an article by a gentleman named Jonathan McClatchy. The whole thing's on the Bacterial Flagellum. It's 40 pages long. You think I'm skipping stuff? The mechanistic basis of flagellar assembly is so breathtakingly elegant and mesmerizing that the sheer engineering brilliance of the flagellar modal cannot be properly appreciated without a minimum of cursory knowledge of its underpinning operations. In writing this paper, a relatively high level of technicality has been necessary in order to convey the engineering and sophistication of this nano machine. The sheer beauty and elegance of the bacterial flagellum has been largely hidden from the public view because of the time and patience it takes to understand and absorb the pertinent details of its assembly and operation. But you're not tired, and I'm not stopping yet. Without such detail, however, it is all too easy to underappreciate the engineering grandeur of the flagellar apparatus. There's a guy named Berg from Harvard who's a biophysicist that says the flagellum is the most incredible, amazing, efficient machine in the universe. All right, go. Okay, Jerry, I forgot to tell you, we're skipping this part. So you need to go to your time thing and you move it over to where, let me get my notes here. Where do I want you to move that thing? I want you to move it to 2 minutes and 15 seconds, I think it is. That'll be close enough. Nope, you got to go a little farther. Keep going. Right there. Okay. Now don't start it yet. Right there. All right. Class, what I just skipped was the explanation of how this thing is, how it's made to move. How do you get a motor to move like that inside a cell? It's from an imbalance of acid across the membranes. And it takes almost zero energy. And it rotates at 17,000 times per minute. If we could figure out how to do 1/10,000,000th of what the cell does, we'd never have the next energy issue ever. But this happened by the blind forces of physics. Keep going. Jerry, are you there? Okay, here we go. Okay, stop. Here's the thing I haven't even told you yet, class. The machine itself is so amazing, I'm overwhelmed. But what you don't know, class, not only do we have the machine, but the cell, the little one-cell bacteria, when it divides, doesn't have a flagellum. You listening? When it divides and makes two little bacteria, the bacteria flagellum goes away. So guess what? It has to build them again. And inside every one of those little one-celled organisms is the built-in process to build a new flagellum. It takes it about 20 minutes once it's made to build a new flagellum, or 12 new ones. And we have tracked that down so we know what every step of that process is. We know what's going on in there. But it's doing it by itself with no straw boss, with nobody guiding it. And it's amazing what the blind forces of physics can do. So the next part of this film, which was made, by the way, by a Japanese company some years ago, and I appreciate it so much that they've made it open use. It's designed to show you how the bacterial flagellum is assembled inside every little one-celled organism that has them by itself. Okay, so first you got the Fly-F protein that makes the MS ring. Keep going. I'm going to go fast with this. Keep going. Next you form the C ring down underneath here by the Fly-G protein. Different protein. Inside there's a mechanism being built that's going to pump things up. Below that is the Fly-M and Fly-N proteins. Stop right there for just a second. This whole mechanism here, that's 26 copies of the same protein made in circular fashion. Same down here, 3 sets of them. And now they're getting ready to take this structure inside and move it up, as I'll tell you about a little more in just a moment. You with me so far? Folks, how does the cell know when to build what? How does it know what order? Look, folks, there are sections in the DNA that have operons and that within them have messages that tell you when to build this first, and then this second, and then this third. Go. So here comes the rod coming up with some, that's called a rod cap. Comes up in front of it, and then around the sides, separately, but all at the same time, are the moat A and moat B. What do you think, class? Proteins building the stator, which connects to the middle layer called the peptidoglycan layer, and that's what makes them stable. And so the thing can sit there and not shake while it's rotating at 17,000 times per minute. Okay, stop right there. Thank you. All right, so in the meantime, it's been building the rod up the middle. And by the way, there's this piping machine down below that's like a gun shooting proteins up here. And by the way, that gun's got to go out here and pick the right protein at the right time and shoot it up the middle. I'm sorry. All right, go ahead. So here's the rotor. The rod, pardon me. And then the L ring and the P ring, stop right there. The L ring is a different protein and the P ring is a different protein. That's an interesting story. The P ring cannot be built by bringing stuff up the middle. There has to be a chaperone protein out here that makes you bring the stuff in just for the P ring. Special protein for the the L ring, which are both acting like bushes, and they've had to cut through the cell wall to do it, which took another, thank you, specially to cut through. Keep going. Well, that's slow, isn't it? All right, there, stop right there. We just got rid of that cap thing and we've made a new cap for the hook. The next thing's going to be built here. You're now outside the cell wall and you've got to build the hook. Well, you see that 5 pattern? That's 5 proteins of the same thing with little sticks below it, and that's a cap. And it's going to be the guiding force for building the hook. Go. So here we go. Stop right there. It's being pumped up from below, and all of these are proteins specific for the hook. Folks, that hook has to be 55 nanometers long or it doesn't work. Guess how it does that? Proteins. If you had another 10 minutes, I'd explain to you how that works. But it gives signals as to when to stop building the hook. Because if you make it too long or too short, it doesn't work. And when you're finished building the hook, keep going. That cap drops off, watch. Boom, there he goes. And you have some fish hook filament junction proteins, first and second line, stop right there, and then you start, no, go a little further. Keep going. Right there, and you're building a new cap. This is called the filament cap. There's 5 different proteins, different from the other ones, with their own special properties. And I love what Behe says about that in his book. Where did I put it? Right here, The Edge of Evolution. I'm telling you, class, if you want to get into this, you need to read these books I'm telling you about. But Behe calls this cap the twinkle toes. Twinkle toes. And the reason is, you see, she's got 5 pieces of protein up here with 5 legs. And these legs are the twinkle toes, folks. They do amazing things. Because starting now, we're finally getting to the filament, which is the thing that makes it move after all this buildup. So here we are with the filament, and it's being guided by the filament cap. Why is the cap important? It's important, class, because if it isn't there, first place, you can't unfold the proteins that are being pumped up the middle. And second, they go floating off into the cellular waste. And third, it makes them line up the way they're supposed to. So I'm going to let him play this now. I'll probably still stop you, Jerry, so let's get started. The mismatch between the 5 legs of the protein, yeah, stop right there. I forgot to tell you this. The filament has 11 strands. Does 5 go into 11, class? No. One of those is in every other spot, so there's an empty place. You get it? One of those legs goes between every other one. But there's 11 of the strands, so there's an empty space. And somebody might think, well, that's a stupid mistake. No, it isn't. The mismatch is not a mistake. It's a part of an elegant design for the assembly system. As a copy of the flagellum protein is pushed down or pushed up the hollow tube to be added to the growing end of the filament, it is prevented from floating out into space by the filament cap, and the cap allows the flagellum time to fold into its functional shape and then directs it to the empty space in the growing filament. So as that protein comes up, it unfolds and then it directs it to the empty space. Now what? That one's full. Well, it rotates, and then now there's another one empty, and it makes the next one go into that one. And then it rotates, and the next one goes into that one. And it lifts its leg back and forth. Go ahead. Are you doing it? Keep going. As the flagellum fills the proper vacant position, the pentagonal cap rotates so the next available slot is now in position to be filled. To do this, Twinkle Toes lifts one of its legs and moves it over a notch. Twinkle Toes rotates again to the next space, and the next leg swings over tens of thousands of times. Class, you want to know how many filaments there are in that strand that's about 15 micrometers long? Between 20 and 30,000. So what you're watching there happens between 20 and 30,000 times with Twinkle Toes. We're through with that one, Jerry. Thank you. Go to the next one. Molecular machines are made up of multiple protein processes. Each one is complex and suited. Every single protein, of which there's over 40, has been designed for its job. Each machine is highly sophisticated, intricate, dynamic, and elegant. Humans have not done anything close to what the flagellum does. These machines are spontaneously self-assembled in the cell, and there are thousands of them in every living cell. No wonder Anthony Flew, who was a debater, atheist, author for all his life, after he saw the results of all this evidence we've compiled here over the last 70 years, wrote a book saying, there is no, a God. And its undertitle is, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And he did it, class, when he was 80 years old. I appreciate a guy at 80 that'll change his mind about something as significant as that. And here's what he said in an earlier interview. It has become inordinately difficult even to begin to think about constructing a naturalistic theory of the evolution of that first reproducing organism. The enormous complexity by which the results were achieved looks to me like the work of intelligence. It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. And I say amen. Is it reasonable, class, to believe in a great designer in this scientific age? I say to you, it's more reasonable than it has ever been. And one of these days, there's going to be some scientist standing in the presence of God, and he's going to say, what did I have to do? What did I have to do? I've opened up the world to you, and you still don't believe. Thank you for your attention. That's my lesson for tonight.